Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's your Kiwi Connection here, Kid7, and today we have an interesting video as we're putting the best R9 280X I tested up against the base, or the worst if you want to put it that way, R9 290, which is the reference model. So this will be quite interesting. So it's basically going to see the top tier of Sapphire 280X line as well as the best one I tested against the very bottom of the 290s and seeing sort of how much difference there is between them. So these are running two different GPUs. The 280X has the Tahiti GPU, which is obviously 280X is the same as a 7970, so it's getting pretty old now. Quite an old GPU, but it still is very good. As I said in my other reviews, it still packs a bit of a punch. Against the more modern and vastly sort of superior in terms of being more efficient and more powerful Hawaii GPU, which is in the 290. So there's quite a bit of difference there in just the raw GPU power, but there is a difference in speeds too. So the Sapphire 280X comes in at 1150 megahertz on boost. So that's pretty high, whereas the 290, the reference, it just comes in at 947 megahertz. But as I said, the Hawaii GPU is a lot more powerful at its core. So even though it's not running as high clock speeds, it's still a lot more powerful. There's also a difference in the memory. So this one's a bit easier to explain. I mean, it's basically 3 gigabytes on the 280X and 4 gigabytes on the 290. Does that really matter with 1080p, which all my tests are done in? No. 3 gigabytes is more than enough. You may start to notice benefits going up through the resolutions though. So there is that to consider, but also the memory bus, and this is what's more important. The 290 is sitting on a 512-bit memory bus, whereas the 280X is sitting on a 384-bit memory bus. So there's a bit of difference. Obviously the memory speeds are lower on the reference 290 at 5000 compared to the 6400 on the 280X, but as I said, that's on a lower memory bus. So there's a bit of difference, but all these numbers are just exactly that, numbers, because they're two completely different GPUs, but something that is something important is the coolers. So the 280X has the really good toxic cooler on it, which is basically the same as the Tri-X cooler on the 290 that you're familiar with from all my 290 Showdown videos. It's pretty much the same, except for a few little differences. It has a backplate, the 280X, opposed to the Tri-X 290, which doesn't. And the center fan is quite small compared to the outside two on the Toxic compared to the Tri-X, with all the same size. Aside from that, it's very minor differences, but it's pretty much the same good Tri-X cooler. Where the reference 290 has AMD's notorious reference cooler on it, which is called anything, I like to call it the hairdryer. So it's a blower style cooler, which means it blows the air through the cards sideways and then out the back of the case. This does have one benefit in that it generally does lower the temperatures inside the case if you don't have good airflow, because it's exhausting all the hot air out the back. Whereas non-reference designs, like on the Toxic, the air is sort of dissipated everywhere inside the case, and a little bit still at the back, but that can raise temperatures inside the case if you don't have good airflow. The downside, obviously, is that the 290's reference design, although it exhausted out the back, it does a quite a bit worse job. I mean, this is one fan versus three, and also these three fans are blowing through the card, through the fins, rather than sideways out. So the cooler on the Toxic is much, much superior to the 290 cooler. And so with that bigger cooler, there's obviously larger size, although it isn't actually too much bigger. So the Toxic comes in at 308 millimeters long compared to the 289 millimeters long of the reference 290. The toxic is 113 millimeters wide to the reference 290 is 126 millimeters wide, and they're both 41 millimeters tall. So they're pretty similar, except the toxic's a bit longer and the 290 is slightly fatter. Now into the benchmark. So this is the interesting part. How do these cards stack up against each other? So first up we have Furmark. This is for 15 minutes, 4 times MSAA. The Toxic 280X from Sapphire scored 24 frames per second average. The Reference R9 290 scored 29 frames per second average. So 5 frames there for the 290. Now Unigine Valley. This is on the Extreme HD preset. The Toxic 280X scored an average of 48 frames per second average. The Reference R9 290, 53.3 frames per second average. So 5 frames there as well. Now into Unigine Heaven 4.0. This is DirectX 11, everything maxed out. The Toxic R9 280X from Sapphire scored 39.1 frames per second average. The Reference R9 290 scored 48.5 frames per second average. So that one's a bit bigger of a gap there. We're seeing, 9 frames better on that 290. Now, Heaven again, this is an OpenGL with everything maxed out. The Toxic 280X, 32.1 frames per second average. The Reference R9 290, 35.2 frames per second average. So OpenGL usually brings them closer together, and it does, so only about 3 frames there. Now into some games. So this is what counts. Toxic 280X in Tomb Raider, everything maxed out, without VSync, scored an average of 70 frames per second. That's very good. The Reference R9 290 scored 72.3 frames per second, so we're seeing a very close fight in Tomb Raider. That Tahiti GPU putting up a hell of a fight in that one. Lastly, Bioshock Infinite. This is everything maxed out. The 280X scored 99.4 frames per second average. The Reference R9 290, 108 frames per second average, so about 8 frames there. So let's say through all the tests we saw, roughly between 5 and 9 frames per second difference. So, for the sake of it, let's just say 6 to 7 average better on the Reference 290 than the Toxic. So this is just showing that even the very fastest of the 280Xs that I've tested still can't beat the base model 290. It's just too powerful. The Hawaii GPU is just too powerful. So interesting result there. Now onto temperatures. So obviously it's not all just about performance. Temperatures and noise come into it too. So it would be no surprise here that the Toxic did a lot better than the Reference 290. Now, before I say the temperatures, you have to consider that these are 2 different GPUs with 2 different thermal limits. So the Tahiti GPU has a thermal limit of 85 degrees Celsius, whereas the Hawaii GPU has a thermal limit of 95 degrees Celsius. There's also a difference that the 280X gets a little bit grumpy after 80 degrees Celsius, and my Asus one I tested completely shut off when it hit its thermal limit of 85 degrees. The 290s are not like that. They will run up to their maximum temperature and they will just sit there. They're completely fine with it. AMD has stated that these will run up to 95 degrees by design, and that's fine. So keep that in mind. Anyways, during the Furmark test, as I said, it runs for 15 minutes. I take the highest temperature I saw and the highest fan speed I saw. And on the Toxic 280X, that was 73 degrees Celsius at 64% fan speed. Remember, the thermal limit's 85. And on the Reference 290, it was 94 degrees Celsius at 50% fan speed, which I think is the maximum in Catalyst right now. So Yeah, the 290 pretty much runs up to its thermal limit, where the toxic 280X has a good 12 degrees before its thermal limit, or 7 degrees to keep it within the safe zone. So a bit of a difference there. I also took the temperatures in Heaven 4.0 during that benchmark. The highest temperature I saw on the toxic 280X was 68 degrees Celsius. The highest I saw on the reference R9 was again 94 degrees Celsius. So these 290s run really hot, especially the reference ones, and 290Xs run incredibly hot from the factory. So that leads us to noise. So with high temperatures, and as I said before, the reference 290, well, my one, I call it the hairdryer cooler on it, it's very loud. I have to give this one to the Toxic. The Toxic I had the vibrating fan shroud issue, which some of them do, and Tri-X's do that as well on the 290s and 290Xs, so it can happen. It's just something funny with the plastic on the cooler. So my one did it, yours one probably wouldn't. If it does, you can RMA it. So don't take that too much into consideration. But aside from the rattling issue, the 280X Toxic is much, much quieter. It's nowhere near the noise of the 290, which is just so loud. So I'll let you decide for yourself. So this is what the Toxic 280X sounds like at idle. And this is what the reference R9 290 sounds like at idle. And here is the Toxic 280X on load. This was during the Unigen Valley Extreme HD benchmark. And here is the reference R9 290 during the Unigen Valley benchmark on load. So as you can hear, that's a huge difference. The Toxic 280X is a much quieter card, and the reference 290 and reference 290X, as everyone knows, are incredibly loud. They sound like a hairdryer or a jet turbine engine on a plane, or they're just an incredibly loud card. But that, again, is by design, with AMD thinking that gamers don't care as much about noise as they do about performance, and as we saw, this 290 performed better. So that leads me overall. Now, this one's a bit more difficult. So I'm going to give you two ways to look at this. So it depends on what you want out of a card, basically. So if you just want the highest performing card, that's it. Performance is all you care about. Then get the 290, the reference 290. Plain and simple. These things are very cheap now, used too. A lot of people bought them during all the cryptocurrency hype, and now for mining, and now they don't want them. The same goes for 290Xs. So they're very cheap now to buy in New Zealand and probably where you live as well. So keep that in consideration. It's going to be better, the 290 performance-wise, but you are making a sacrifice that you don't have to make on the 280X Toxic, which is obviously the higher temperatures and the noise. So you can run like I do, I don't run the fan curve that comes stock. I run my stock R9 290 as my in-between card, and I use Precision X and run my own more aggressive fan curve. With the fan curve I'm currently running, when I do benchmarks or anything like that, or play a game, it keeps it under its thermal limit, but not by much. It still runs up to 90-91 degrees, so I still only have about 4 or 5 degrees there until the thermal limit. But just to bring it down a tiny bit, and saying that, obviously there's a lot more noise. So you can do that too, and it gives you slightly less throttling, which will give you a more consistent performance out of it. You don't have to do that with that Toxic card though. It'll also allow you to overclock it slightly more. You can overclock these 290s a bit, but as I said, you're going to have to be running a pretty demon aggressive fan curve to be able to keep the thing cool. So yeah, it's a toss-up, but personally, what I'm going to recommend you do, buy a good set of headphones, better noise cancelling the better, and get the reference R9 290. Preferably if you can get it second hand, then it probably actually might cost you less than buying the 280X Toxic brand new. So it might actually be cheaper, obviously depending where you live and what the market's like at the moment. So that's what I'd say personally to do. But if that's not your thing and you really dislike loud cards or really hot cards, then get the 280X. Just keep in mind you'll be taking about a 6 to 7 frames per second average performance hit going to the 280X Toxic over the reference R9 290. So that's going to finish up this video. I hope it was informative. I try to keep it as impartial. I give it my own opinion, obviously, but I try to address all sides of it, so I hope you can take that into consideration too. And I'll catch you guys next time.